questions as much as anything else. He's our resource for this ordinance adoption. So because this is a joint work session, the Planning Board and the Conservation Commission, this is your opportunity to, ask questions, debate, discuss, and use our resource here so that everyone's in a good position to make a decision and recommendation on moving forward with the timber harvest ordinance. So I'm going to just do a quick overview of the Shoreland Zone for those of you who don't know much about it. And Tom's going to talk more about how it works and how it's been working in the state and what it might mean for Auburn. And because this is a joint meeting, I'm also going to turn it over to Evan and Jordan to say whatever they need to say as we get started and make sure we all know each other. So I'm Audrey Knight, City Planner.
Megan Norwood, City Planner 2.
Dan Carroll, Planning Board member.
Tom Gilbert, Water Resources Specialist with the Maine Forest Service. Which is one of the things that I do with White River. James Conlon, Planning Board.
Conservation Commission. Neil Lewis, Conservation Commission. Jake Foslow, Conservation Commission.
Sam Boss, Conservation Commission.
Morris James, Conservation Commission.
Jordan Tate, Conservation Commission.
Evan Sear, Planning Board.
Matt Ball, Planning Board.
Katie Voss, Planning Board.
Brian Carrier, Planning Board.
Leroy Walker, Councilman, Ward 5.
Larry Pelletier, Citizen.
Kyle Heffernan, Planning Board.
Stephen Martelli, Planning Board.
So we're having a joint meeting to discuss between the Planning Board and the Conservation Commission to discuss the timber harvest ordinance. I'm going to let Audrey get into the specifics of our current ordinance and the choices that are coming to us from the state, as well as why the state's asking us to make those choices. But Jordan and I are each going to share just a brief synopsis of where each entity is. That way, folks on the Conservation Commission know what the Planning Board's done, and we can get a sense of sort of what you guys have talked about in terms of this so far. So, would you like to begin, or would you like me to begin? It's up to you. All right, fair enough. This is fairly preliminary for us. The Planning Board at this point has reviewed our current zoning ordinance that would apply to shoreland timber harvest. We've been briefed on the state's desire that we change the ordinance and why they're asking us to change the ordinance. We've also had a chance to briefly look at the possible options. After briefly looking at some of the possible options, we've asked Audrey as a board to come back with an explanation or discussion of some of the options we felt might fit Auburn best. And so that's where the Planning Board is at on this process.
And why Tom's?
Right.
So the Conservation Commission, very similarly to Planning Board, this is pretty preliminary for us as well. Because we don't necessarily have authority, we're an education advisory and advocacy board. We reviewed the ordinance and we're pretty open to discussing the different options. We also consulted with our Lewis and Auburn Community Forest Board subcommittee and reached out to one of the former members of that committee who's a professional forester to receive their feedback. So, open to discussing the different options and voting as we support. Obviously, conservation is one of our big priorities, so.
I circulated that letter. I don't know if everyone received a copy. I probably did not make as many copies as I needed to make sure that everyone got one. Essentially, this is a letter from David Griswold. Thanks for the information. He can't attend, and he highly recommends that Auburn adopt the state rules, which attached for the following reasons, and he lays out a set of 3 or 4 reasons that he believes it's a good idea to adopt it and the registered forester. So you can circulate this copy if anyone wants to have it. So just to kind of give you an overview, I hope all of you received the packet. One of the items on there was the letter to our city manager from the state, essentially requesting us to take action. Just kind of do something already. right? Choose one of these options, make it happen. This thing was adopted in 2012, and it's 2019. So they're looking for all the municipalities and localities in the state to implement state adopted standards, one way or another, which is reasonable and rational. The second item on your packet is the 3 options that we have as a community in adopting the standards. And it shows option 1, 2, and 3. Essentially, option 1 is to just take out the repeal, that's the word I was looking for. It's been a long day already. Repeal our existing timber harvest section in the SLO, the Shoreland Zoning District, and then adopt the statewide standards in its entirety. And you've seen the statewide standards, I think it's like 29 pages, 30 pages? Yeah, this that you got, which is very in-depth and very detailed and very good document to have, but we wouldn't want to adopt the whole thing into our ordinance at verbatim. But by repealing ours and adopting the state standards, we would be adopting this in its entirety. Option 2 is to adopt the timber harvest standards that are identical to the statewide standard, but allow the option to retain some local control over administration and enforcement. However, that takes some negotiating as to what role would we have in enforcing it versus the state, and how would we do it. So it does raise a bunch of questions for us that we don't really have answers to right now. Option 3 is to retain its current timber harvest standards, regulating that. But this is where it gets a little tricky, because if that's in effect and consistent with state laws as of 2005, so we would need to verify that. But that 3 is a little tricky, and that's one of the reasons why we're here as well. But we wanted to discuss this in detail at the last planning board, but it does get a little fuzzy in terms of differences between the options. So that's in your packet. You also got a copy of the existing timber harvest text, which amounts to 3 pages versus 29 pages. So that was the main difference that I found. 3 pages versus 29. So that's the easy explanation. You also received a summary information sheet of how this applies, as well as the full documentation from the Bureau of Forestry for the state standards. So that is a summary of what you have in your packet. And how many of you are familiar with the shoreland zone, the shoreland ordinance? Just period. Okay. Oh, we have new members. Hey, all right, we need some more introductions. Oh, yeah, we got them all around. Okay, so we'll start with you.
I'm Josh Renagine. Actually, I live in Lewiston, but I'm involved in trail work in both Lewiston and Auburn. And interested in all environmental assets that are in existing communities.
Great, all right, welcome. We introduced everybody, and so you're the only, yeah.
I'm Kathy Shaw, Valley View Farm and Four Seasons Farm Market in Auburn.
Bill Sylvester, 1128 Riverside Drive, Auburn.
Ned Claxton, State Senator from Auburn Maine, Mechanic Falls, Poland, and Gloucester.
That was great. We have a full house. All right. So we've got 45 minutes to an hour to have this joint session. So I'm just going to do hopefully a brief overview of the shoreland zone and how the timber harvest plays into it. I'll have to tell you, in all my 20 years plus in planning, the shoreland zoning ordinance is one of the most complicated ones I have seen in 7 states. And I'm just saying that off the top of my head, because when I started reviewing this, I'm like, what? Because it's fairly mathematical. It requires a lot of understanding of coverage, land coverage, the DBH of a tree and the tree stands, and how much coverage is in the tree stand, and how many DBHs are within a certain area. More stuff than I can handle in reviewing on site. And it applies, it's a mandatory act covering the whole state. Most of you are probably familiar with that. But it is comprised of all land within 250 areas horizontal distance of the normal high water line of any great pond or river, upland edge of a coastal wetland, including all areas affected by tidal action, upland edge of defined freshwater wetlands, all land areas within 75 feet horizontal distance of the normal high water line of certain streams. So it affects all of those geographies. Oh, this thing's really, no, that's better. Uh-oh. I told you I'd never run this one before. Ah. So the intent of the law is there's a lot of intents. Obviously, it's to protect water quality, wildlife habitat, wetlands, archaeological, historic, commercial fishing, conserve shore cover, public access, natural beauty, open space. And it does this by controlling land uses and placement of structures within the shoreland area. Boy, this is touchy. Okay. So again, not to go through all of this, it's logical, it's intuitively obvious, and this gets into all of the purposes and reasons. But it does anticipate and respond to the impacts of development in the shoreline zones, and that's why these standards have been developed. Because we know everyone wants access to the water, everyone wants to get in it, see it, play in it, live next to it, hike it, woods next to it, timbers next to it, and so the state tried to find ways to protect our state resources, which is a huge part of our tourist industry as well. So a few basics on vegetation you may not know, but all of the great ponds, Taylor Pond, Auburn, Lake, Androscoggin River, clearing of vegetation is prohibited within 75 feet of the normal high water line of a great pond zoned for resource protection. Timber harvesting is also prohibited within 75 feet of the normal high water line of a great pond zone for resource protection. To provide for screening between development activities in the water, cleared openings are prohibited within a strip extending 75 feet inland from the normal high water line, and a well-distributed stand of vegetation must remain. So the purpose of this is to protect views both from the lake and for habitat for wildlife, as well as, yes?
Now, does that include invasives?
No. That's a good question. Maybe. I don't think so. I think you want to get those invasives out of there.
For timber harvesting, there are limitations on harvesting within that 75 feet, but I wouldn't say prohibited. It's go back to the DBH, the diameter of breast heights, it's the area of the trees occupied. 40% is what we need within that 75 feet under statewide standards.
40%, if you can calculate that. So, there shall be no cleared opening greater than 250 square feet in the forest canopy or other existing woody vegetation if a forested canopy is not present. A single footpath not to exceed 6 feet in width as measured between tree trunks and or shrub stems is allowed for accessing the shoreline, provided that a cleared line of sight to the water through the buffer strip is not created. So in other words, it should tack back and forth and not be a straight line down the stream, again, to protect views, visual buffers, and habitat, as well as erosion control. So natural ground up, saplings, and mature canopy retain nutrients on site, which leads to better water quality, which is what we want. Grass does not lead to better water quality. It creates nutrient problems. So, you might have seen this, I don't know that that was in the, but this is how things are calculated. And it would take me a while to figure this out if I went on site and tried to figure out how many trees and points meet this standard. So the black dots are 2 to 4 inches DBH, it gives you 1 point. The horizontal hatches are 4 to 8 inches, you get 2 points for those. The blue dots are 8 to 12 inches, you get 4 points for those. And the checkerboard marks are 12 inches or greater in diameter, and you get 8 points for those. So, this is a point system. Some municipalities have a point system based on a 20-foot by 20-foot plot, rather than a 20-foot by 50-foot plot. This gets into the details of how you're supposed to regulate shore coverage and removal of vegetation along the shore. This is why I'm saying this is a head spinner for us and the how do we implement this thing category. And those have to be retained. Is the cutting of vegetation less than 2 inches in diameter limited? Yes. State law prohibits new clear openings from being created within the buffer area. So these are the kinds of standards that are in the current existing shoreland zone. This is probably a whole afternoon. In fact, Megan and I recently took a whole day with the state to go over some shoreline zoning, and that's how long it took, and we really didn't even get that far in depth. So, sufficient to say it's complicated, it's not easy, there are a lot of parameters and rules that make it sometimes a challenge to implement. But non-vegetated surfaces shall not exceed a total of 20% of the portion of the lot located within the shoreline zone. So if you think about the lots out there fronting the shoreline zone, there should be no more than 20% of that lot covered with any structures. That's set on the land. Mostly that's so that you have permeable surface for drainage purposes around the shoreline. So we're moving into the timber harvest section. So why we're here tonight is to talk about the specifics of timber harvesting. Not necessarily if you're clearing for another use, that's a different standard through DEP. This is for the purposes of a timber business or a harvesting business in which the purpose of harvesting the trees is the main activity. So, we're defining this as cutting or removing of timber for the primary purpose of selling or processing forest products on parcels over 2 acres in size. So anything over that. There are 2 buffer widths depending on watershed size, 250-foot buffers on rivers downstream of a watershed draining over 25 square miles. So, Tom's here because I did not understand what that meant.
Quick question, I mean,
Yeah.
do we know how many acres of Auburn fits in that?
Very good question, no.
Okay.
Yes.
And are we clear cutting or selective cutting?
Hopefully selective cutting in the shoreline zone. There wouldn't be clear cutting allowed in the shoreline zone under statewide standards. So this is where what we were just talking about is the mandatory shoreline zoning act. I think most of that applies to development, cutting vegetation for review, for example. This is just timber harvesting, harvesting trees for the purpose of producing forest products. So for the purpose of timber harvesting, we have these 2 buffer widths. There's 250-foot buffer width is the large one for our large water bodies, and then 75-foot for our, say, medium-sized rivers and streams, and then for our smaller streams that are upstream of a 300-acre drainage point, there's no buffer width, but there are other protections. For example, shoreland integrity, stream bank integrity. You're not allowed to crush the stream banks, for example, to crossing the river, for example. So that is a real quick and dirty explanation there. As far as what we mean by these 25 square miles of watershed area, those are all defined in our maps. Whenever a town adopts statewide standards, we produce a map which shows exactly where those buffers are and what bodies what water bodies they apply to, and where that 300-acre drainage point is, for example, of a blue dot on a river. So And those are available to foresters and loggers so they can see exactly where they are on the site. They're geolocated so they can see themselves on the map and where the buffers are as they move through the harvest.
Excuse me. You mentioned that the state would produce those maps.
Yeah.
And so earlier I'm hearing that there are 3 options and really only one of them is state control. If the municipality were to choose one of the other options, does the state provide those materials or is the municipality required to produce maps like that?
So under option 1 or option 2, we would provide a map.
Okay.
Under option 1, as was explained, we would take over enforcement administration. Option 2, we could also take over enforcement administration solely, if that's your choice, or you have the option to say, well, let's have a joint agreement. Under option 3 is where you're kind of on your own. So we do have, I think, municipal maps, but they don't include like the buffer widths that you have assigned or water bodies. We wouldn't produce that for you.
As a municipality, would we be required to produce those?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So, that's where it gets a little squirrely with the drainage basins, because, the 25 square miles or the 300 acres, it has to be calculated based on the stream or pond. Okay. We do have, obviously, forest activities. We probably have some forestry activities occurring near the Androscoggin, as well as probably on the Little Androscoggin, potentially some other smaller tributaries. But other than that, it may only be limitedly applied to Auburn as a whole. So let's move on to the next. So the kinds of things that are in this 29-page document are, these are the standards that we're looking at adopting, either way. Within 250-foot buffers, there are 2 options for shade tree retention. Harvesting no more than 40% of total tree volume of trees 4.5 dBH in 2-year period, or a residual stand with an average basal area of 60 square feet per acre of 1 dBH with 40 square feet per acre of 4.5 dBH or greater. I don't feel capable of implementing this. I would need a forester or somebody else to help implement this ordinance. So for what it's worth from a staff perspective, we don't have the capability in-house to implement this.
Do we have any full-time foresters on staff right now?
No.
So we have only arborists then?
I think we have 1 tree guy in Public Works.
Part-time.
Okay.
Who provides the enforcement of the current ordinance?
The current shoreland zone.
Yeah.
Your beleaguered staff.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mr. Woolman, the state is in charge of the operation. I know with cutbacks and everything else, the department gets down rather low. Who's in charge of coming back out to make sure that the logging interest or private interest have done what they said that they were supposed to do?
We have 10 district foresters around the state. They have their own districts that they're well familiar with. They know all the actors within their districts. And so I think Shane Dugan would be your district forester, would be the first responder to any issue. Typically, if it's an issue of greater severity, he would also call a ranger. We have many more rangers, so they would get involved. Usually if there's a water quality issue, the ranger may be involved. So we have good staff of rangers and 10 district foresters around the state. And there's a pretty good educational component to what we do as well. We have 4 planners at the Augusta office who do a lot of education outreach about this.
How are those districts broken out? Are we in a large district that would require a lot from Shane?
One of the smaller districts.
We're in a
the
smaller
south.
district.
Yeah, we used to have 12, used to be by county.
Right.
But now it's just short. So in the southern, I think it's pretty close to what your county looks like.
Are there currently any issues with timeliness, initial inspection of sites? Is there currently a backlog?
I would say no. They're pretty busy, but I don't think that it's to the point where we're thinking we can't keep up, we can't manage our workload. I think we're doing pretty well with that.
So when we circulated printout, you sent me the variance structure. It was kind of a breakdown of
Yeah.
how it's currently operating with other municipalities, and how that's working. Maybe you can kind of walk through that a little bit?
Okay. So, this is a real brief kind of overview. I think many of you have this MFS Variance Procedures document here. But it's really just to give you an idea of how we approach the variance process. As you can see here, we don't have these requests often, and when we do, often they're approved and largely related to insects, disease, and wind impacts. In those few instances where they're not approved, they were deemed, the action was just deemed unnecessary. So it has to do with some kind of unforeseen circumstance, mostly the insect and weather, not just that these regulations are inconvenient. So one thing, I spoke with my boss a bit about this whole process, and under option 1, we would still implement this process, the whole variance process for whom it applies. Under option 2, I believe the town would be, or the city would be responsible for implementing the variance process, because you would be adopting the standards into your ordinance, so you wouldn't be implementing the variance process under option 2.
So we would be incorporating this into our current, we repeal what we have and put this in place.
Right.
Currently, our timber ordinance has one section that addresses the planning board's role in this. It says timber harvesting operations exceeding the 40% limitation in subsection B1 above may be allowed by the planning board upon a clear showing, including a forest management plan signed by a Maine licensed professional forester, that such an exception is necessary for good forest management and will be carried out in accordance with the purposes of the SLO district. The planning board shall notify the commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection of each exception allowed within 14 days of the planning board's decision. That's pretty much the only area where we have local input on a variation at this point, which is basically following the same process that you just outlined for variation. The state would look at instead of the planning board, correct?
For timber harvest, under option 1, the state would.
Yes.
And under option 2, my understanding that the planning board would be responsible for being well versed enough in this document to be able to justify a variance if needed?
We would hope, yeah, I mean, I think we would be at the disposal of the city if they want some input as to where to go with things on a variance request, but I think the administration of that request would be the city's responsibility under option 2.
Under the current ordinance, if you're just a private landowner and you want to do some timber harvesting to get wood for fuel, do you have to go through a licensed forester if you're going to do that on the shoreland? And I'm just trying to understand what the process would be so that we know what enforcement would need to take place.
So you mean under statewide standards, or?
Yeah, under statewide standards.
It's always recommended that you have a licensed forester involved in any timber harvest, but it's not required. And you have to, as the definition says, it'd be for the production of timber products, and you're harvesting more than 2 acres of land. So it'd be bona fide timber harvest, not just removing a few trees for firewood. It'd be different land use.
Otherwise, it might run into the basics of the shoreland zoning if you're clearing vegetation and trees more than 2 dBH at the shoreland, anywhere within that 75 or 250 with some research.
So you're saying clearing of under the 2 acres would be the trigger point?
Yeah, beyond, I think over 2 acres would be considered a timber harvest. And again, if you're not clearing for development or any other use other than just harvesting.
I mean, but what happens is that continues on a continuing basis. I mean, if you're clearing 2 acres every year, eventually you're going to get within the zone, so where would the state step in had it been the state's responsibility?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, it's probably one I would ask a district forester about. I could get back to you on that, but
Do these harvests require some sort of a permit? Or are we talking about rules that only come into play if an abutter or someone in the area happens to file a complaint?
there's no permit, but there is a notification. It's a forest operations notification form you fill out and submit to us, and it contains all the information as to what kind of harvest it is and where it's going to take place, who is doing the harvesting, who's the landowner. And so we get about almost 5,000 of those every year, and I believe once you receive them, a copy of that is sent to a local code enforcement officer.
But those don't necessarily trigger some sort of initial inspection? per se?
Not a formal inspection, but our district foresters typically will visit harvests. They always get copies of these. And again, they know the industry, they know the people in the area, the kind of work that they do. If a bad actor pops up, they might just swing by and have a look, or they may just, even if it's not a bad actor, it's just one of their basic things that they do is just kind of have a look at a harvest here.
Audrey, I think you asked how much land was in these protection zones. Was that your question? On my land, it's 31% are in some type of shoreland zoning in one of my lots. Another one, it's 1%. Depends on how much river, great pond, that type of thing. And who enforces it is your code enforcement officer, at least the ones that I've been involved with. You get a code enforcement officer there, I think he's more dealing with electric panels than he is trees, auto. And then if he can't handle it, DEP comes in. That's what's happened on my land. I don't know what, but that kind of sounds like what happens in places that aren't in the state program. So it's code enforcement officer, DEP, Augusta. Sorry, I know I'm not.
No, you're absolutely right, and I really appreciate you stepping in and saying that, because we do get notifications that forestry or forest activity is occurring, or clearing is occurring. Sometimes we'll get a call from a neighbor asking. We get those notifications. Right now, we kind of are overburdened, and we don't know quite what to do with this in terms of going out and inspecting, except to see whether or not there's a huge mess. But as far as this kind of thing, we're not all of our code enforcement officers and ourselves are not necessarily capable of saying, oh yes, you followed the management plan, and here's your management plan, and this looks great. Or the only thing we'd be able to say is, that bank has been crushed by vehicles and needs to be reestablished. So we could make those simple observations. If there was a stream crossing that was obviously violated, we could do those kinds of things. But currently, I think we get notifications of forced activity, depending on the time of year, 2 or 3 a month. Sometimes they'll go for months without anything. Sometimes you'll get 3 or 4 at a time. But there are forest operations here in town. Mostly what we're seeing is clearing for development. And whether or not that clearing actually results in development or is essentially a moneymaker for forest products, I don't know. So those are things we're not really watching. When someone comes in and clears land, we don't really know what's going on there. And if it's more than 2 acres, we'll send somebody out and go, okay, what's going on? So that's happened a few times. In some cases, we require the revegetation.
It seems like a lot of time and energy is going into this, has been and is going to. I think it would be beneficial to know how much land in Albany, how many acres are actually, would be affected by this. What do we have how many acres in Auburn are in the shoreline zone that would be subject to timber harvesting?
So we'd almost need that map before we can do that.
If it's very minimal, there's a lot of this going into nothing. I'm just curious.
Well, in that case, it would be easier to just have the state do it, right? Because
I think
we-
that would help influence the
Yes.
decision if we knew, okay, Auburn, you only have X amount of land that this even deals with. Well, if that's the case, let them deal with it. If it's a huge amount, which knowing Auburn.
We still wouldn't want to deal with it.
Right, no, but I'm just saying, it'd be easier to make that decision. Because I know there's not a lot of land in Auburn that's gonna fall into this anyways. So I'd be curious to know what that actual rough number would be that would help probably everybody make the decision whether or not, how much they want to deal with it. You know, you got Taylor Pond, you got Lake Auburn, you got the shore river. What else?
You know,
Go ahead.
you know, if you have a logging operation like you have up north, you know, in and around the Kingfield, Stratton area, Brochu goes in, buys 195,000 acres,
Totally.
and he puts in a 20-year plan to keep his guys busy. But we don't have that kind of area around here, all right? We've got maybe a 6-acre piece here and a 2-acre piece here.
Yeah.
But what about, you know, just letting the state take care of it, you know, and wash your hands from it?
That's why I think knowing how much land we're even talking about would help everybody make a conscious decision. Is the state able to provide us that preliminary map or number? Or is that something we need to provide to say, okay, we're only talking about this on a scale of this?
Right.
Well, I think what we're already hearing from staff is that the capacity isn't there regardless of what that land mass is.
Pardon?
The capacity for staff to manage that is
Right.
already not there regardless of what the land mass is, how many acres.
We don't have a forester on
Right.
staff.
Right.
So I apologize for interjecting. I'm hearing the conversation mature. Chairperson Tate and I were just discussing, and we're looking at the clock, and we both agreed that it might be beneficial for the commission and the board to receive perhaps a brief synopsis of what the staff sees as the pros and cons of each option, and possibly what the representative from the state might see as pros and cons, and to give us time as a board and a commission to discuss with each other and ask follow-up questions. We don't often get a chance, in fact, this is the first time we really get to sit down with each other. We were both saying we'd really like to make sure that we can workshop, that is to say, discuss the topic at hand. And it's interesting to find out how restrictive and complicated the state standards are, but we're really here to discuss sort of which option we like. And so I'm hearing that we're already beginning to do that, so that might be a good, this might be a good segue to do that.
I did, but it can tie in with this.
So is it possible,
Sure.
Audrey, to sort of, from a staff standpoint,
Well, we have discussed it internally. Frankly, we would prefer option one all the way around. It's cleaner and simpler, and it's easier to implement and incorporate into our current code. If we start monkeying around trying to add this or put in that, we get into incorporating 29 pages, because it has to be verbatim, into our current ordinance in its entirety, as well as making a provision for local variance review, or what the city's role would be. And the city, as was stated, really doesn't have the staff to make to review these projects as they need to. So there's no reason to go with option two necessarily. Option one is a lot cleaner.
does given the specialized nature of the topic, does staff have capacity to exercise an option two? That is to say, is there anyone on staff that would currently be qualified to read through it and make appropriate recommendations for municipal control in areas?
You're talking about specifically what areas could, the only,
So
in
in
our,
option two, as I'm understanding it, that we would be adopting this, but then we would be required to manage variances. Correct?
that, is that right?
Yeah.
That's one option, or is that the option?
That's option two.
No, I mean, is that the option under option two, is really that the city retains some control
Yeah.
over enforcement and variances,
Right.
pretty much.
My understanding, The simplest way to explain is that the city could still implement permitting requirements, for example. There's some administrative things that city can do, kind of have a hand in it. But I think on the whole, Maine Forest Service would probably still take the lead in enforcement and notify the city when things are going on. It's the basic idea of how that would go.
But it's my understanding that we would still be responsible for describing how those variances are handled, which means we need to have someone on staff that understands this to be able to write an appropriate procedure for us to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Do we have someone with that background?
Well, I mean.
Let me ask a more specific pointed question. I know that we have talented staff. Do we have?
A position, because people come and go. We have a position that does that and will do that in perpetuity.
With specifically
No.
a forestry background?
Everything's put on the code enforcement officer. Do you realize how many things the code enforcement officer actually does? Okay.
So, so that was option 1 and 2. Option 3, from the staff's perspective.
Not viable. It's complicated, it's more than we can handle. We would need to revise our current standards regardless, in some way, shape, or form to mirror the outcomes of the state's objectives. If we don't adopt it wholeheartedly, we would still need to meet the state standards.
So as strict or more strict?
Yes, as
So
strict or more
similar to
strict,
zoning?
yes.
And for context, what's the reason that we waited this long since the passing of the statewide requirement to review? Or have we reviewed it in the past and there was some background that we should know?
I have not been here long enough to know that history. I think at one point it popped up and then died, but we did, the stimulus this time was a letter we received January 7th, 2019 from Doug Denenico, Director of Maine State Forest Service, to the city manager asking us to act on this.
So my institutional knowledge only goes back so far. When I started on the board in 2011, subsequent to that, this hasn't come up. So.
Just wondering if there were other past conversations to fold into tonight's review or not, but it sounds like it was just reviewed.
Yeah, and that's why I'm wondering, feeling that there's a small amount of area that I believe we're discussing, what has been the negative vibe out there, why we wouldn't just take option 1? Has there been anything discussed, or is there any council, any member, anybody out there that feels we shouldn't just take option 1?
We did receive one call when this came up over the winter, stating that the requirements are fairly stringent in terms of the maintenance and the planning required in terms of culverts and other things that need to be in place to cross streams and maintain integrities of streams. So we did receive one call that said, look, this is already in front of the legislature this summer. There's some people that are going in to try to revise this. Why don't you wait? And that's kind of where we've had some lag. But we have also heard on the other side, which is from other foresters who said, they're doing the right thing. This is the right way to go.
So I have a question, maybe you can answer it. Of places that have not chosen option 1, why have they done so? And what are the benefits to those municipalities from making that choice?
I couldn't really speak to the benefits. I know there are some municipalities that just prefer to have local control. And, I guess they would be the ones to talk about what benefits are. I think this is a great deal for any town. We get a great benefit from having the Maine Forest Service handle this, which is a big job for a lot of towns. I personally don't see any drawbacks at all. But this is the process we're doing here, having the towns opt in rather than just kind of put the regulation on towns without what they're saying.
And then one more question, just following up from what Audrey just said. So you were saying that the legislature was going to revise these rules?
Well, there were some motions that went to the state and they died.
Okay, but in the event they had passed, if we take option 1, we don't have to do anything. Is that correct?
We just adopted the state standard.
We've adopted the state standard, so whatever the state standard is, it just rides with it. Yeah.
But if we do option 2, then we have to bring it back.
Keep re-adopting our own.
And re-adopt.
Yeah.
Standards, right?
Got it.
So you're saying there's some communities that did not, they just took the Are they dealing with larger, more wetland than we are? That's why they don't want to get it taken.
I would say there's necessarily a common link between those communities. If you look at a map of all the towns that have and haven't, it's kind of like a checkerboard.
I think we had a question from council.
Well, a couple comments. One was back in like 2014 to 16, a lot of this was brought up because the school department was actually allowing harvesting on their land, but there was question on whether doing it right, doing it wrong, overdoing it, and cutting too close to this, that, and maybe polluting parts of Lake Auburn. Then, 2017, I believe it was, Auburn decided, meaning the water district, to cut another whole section of land. And that stirred up a hell of a lot of questioning, are they doing things right? Did they, didn't they, I don't know, to tell you the truth. But we have never, as councilors, ever had a real direct, what can we do, should we do, shouldn't we do, and how much power do we have? And even after, I believe the state was contacted to find out, did Lake Auburn cut correctly or not, and do whatever has to be done. Afterwards, the airport did a big section that stirred up a whole lot more crap. So we have had pieces around the city of Auburn that had stirred the mud, and people are not happy. It's taken a long time to get to where we are now, but we definitely need to come up with rules. And if we turn it over to the state and they are the leaders of the pack, that's all well and great. But the city of Auburn still has to know exactly what the rules and regulations are. Because when you file a complaint, it takes, it seems like 3 to 10 weeks to get that complaint taken care of. By then, they've cut 15 acres of land by the time somebody's really researched it. We've seen it in South Auburn already when you're there one day, 3 days later you go back, there's 5 acres of land cleared. And I mean cleared, there isn't a toothpick standing out. If they can do that, who's going to enforce the law after? Everything gone. And the last time Kathy and I checked into it, the arborist or the farmer or the woodcutter, whatever, he had a license, he did everything right, and he's gone. But not in the eyes of the beholders out there. He didn't do everything right, because it was cleared, he walked away, there was nothing else ever done except an ugly looking piece of property off the side of the road. And that's why we need somebody, but we need to have that somebody show someone that works for the city of Auburn exactly what we can do with a forestry or landowner or whatever it is that overcuts or cuts we feel in the wrong places out there. So, can we go out there and stop them? Can the council say, oh, we want it stopped? And right now, I don't think we can do that. So,
There's there's statewide standards for timber harvesting in shoreline areas, and then there's the Forest Practices Act. There are two different things. Forest Practices Act will take effect outside of shoreline areas. And per the Forest Practices Act, you can clear cut. It's not an illegal activity as long as it's done a certain way. If you're in a shoreline zone, absolutely not. It's not okay with a shoreline zone. So it all depends on where this activity is located as to what rules would apply.
Can the city adopt its own Forest Practices Act that says you can't clear cut? Just to leave it like, you know, to have some of their
I don't believe so. I know there's a process under statewide standards if the city would like to have their own standards. It's a process where you would be consulted with a licensed forester to do that. I'm not sure if that same process applies to the Forest Practices Act or not. That's something I can look into.
What about permitting options? Not necessarily changing the standards, but having some kind of pre-notification process for the city of Auburn, so we're not finding out about a clearing from a complaint, but instead we have knowledge ahead of time of where these clearings are happening, so we could potentially be more aware ahead of time on, you know, potential issues that could arise, instead of being more reactive, trying to be more proactive by having either like a city level permit application or just notification process for Auburn.
That's a great idea.
it would definitely help when it comes to complaints.
Yeah. Yeah, we get a lot of this, we don't know what's going on.
Right.
So just to clarify, are we talking still about the Shoreland thing?
I think it's either
Or
or.
are we
Jumping away from it.
Yeah.
Or the rock
I mean,
wall.
because what we're talking about now in option one with the state control is just the Shoreland.
Just the Shoreland.
Right.
Personally, I don't want to speak on behalf of all the commission, but in other, things that we've reviewed, enforcement has definitely been something that's come up in our other conversations, and lack of enforcement has been a big concern. So handing that over to the state, like we said, we already don't necessarily have that technical knowledge on staff. If you have to hire a consultant, that's going to be a big cost to the city that would have to come up every time, under option 2 that the state standard change. So personally, I think option 1 makes a lot of sense, and then you could potentially discuss those notification or permitting on the city level that could handle, that ahead of time, but not necessarily have to deal with the standards and enforceability part of that. So, personally, I think option 1 makes most sense for where we're at, and then potentially handling city level permitting and notification separately.
Under option 1, you would not be able to have a permitting process for
Well,
shoreline areas.
Not
Not
shoreline,
on
but
shoreline
in
areas,
other areas
just
where we were talking
generally
about.
Well, that's the difference.
with
Gotcha.
generally
Yeah.
any harvesting,
Right.
or
That's
some,
all
could
different.
we potentially implement like at least a notification process for any harvest in Auburn?
You would have to, basically under option 1, remove all mention of timber harvesting from your ordinance, from the shoreline ordinance.
Shoreland.
But,
Shoreline,
aside from that, I actually couldn't say.
May I ask, we were just talking about teeth, what teeth are there in anything? What's the teeth in the state's arsenal? Do they fine, do they force them to redo it, do they?
Yeah, all the above. We prefer an educational approach. We have a pretty strong emphasis on that. It's something we do routinely when violations occur. Depending on the severity of it, will depend on how we react. If it's as simple, it's a visit where we educate someone on a better way to cross the stream. There wasn't a lot of damage done, but it wasn't done great. That's good. If there's a water quality violation, we like to work with them to fix it, first of all, and then move from there. If there's issues with getting them to act, then certainly fines or something that happen. We're not afraid to do that.
Are there any members of the board or commission who haven't spoken yet that would like to add comment or question?
It would appear to me that basically there are two independent issues, and I think as you correctly pointed out, basically, we really probably might be wise to focus on one issue at a time, but do it independently. And that way we won't, we would eliminate confusion, because it appears that shoreland zoning is one set of clear-cut issues, and then other forest practices are independent, and so that basically it would be a lot easier to look at them as two independent items.
If we go back to having a map showing us how many acres are shoreland, how many acres are available for timber harvest, so that we can make an educated decision. So that would be neat.
Tom, is that something that you guys can do
I can check with
in
our
advance
GIS
of the
specialist.
adoption of option 1?
So you're saying prior to making the decision to take
Right.
option 1?
Right.
Look at the map?
So we know we're going to either do option 1 or 2. Probably. I mean, that's like, so either way, the map would have to be produced, right, under each scenario. So if we were getting the ball rolling on pushing this forward one way or another.
I can check with our GIS specialist and see what his capabilities are. We probably wouldn't produce the whole statewide standards map until it's adopted, but he may have the ability to say, okay, this many acres of forest land in Auburn.
Right. City of Auburn
This
would
geography
have,
is impacted.
12.3 acres impacted. Is anything even, I think with other maps.
Is there a deadline that this has to be implemented?
There's no deadline. There is a point in which statewide standards would be enacted statewide for towns who have taken no action. So you would essentially be forced into statewide standards once we call it critical mass is reached.
When is that?
We have a certain number of critical mass towns
Yeah.
that are chosen based on the acreage of woodland they have and how much forest products come from those towns. So once 250 of those towns have opted in, we've reached critical mass. We're currently at 232, I believe, so 18 more towns away. So within the next couple of years, we expect to reach that critical mass.
Isn't Auburn one of those towns that's been designated as a critical mass?
I'm not sure, possibly.
I ask because I know, I'm wondering why it's coming from.
I have a question, Steve, about the map. What, does the map help you make your decision? Like, what difference is the map gonna make in this decision?
I think
Because
it's
we
for
can't,
the
we heard from staff, we
Well,
can't.
it's like he
If we're
said,
only dealing with this much on this, let's just do it. I think that's the thinking out there. If this really doesn't affect Auburn all that much based on our shoreland, then why are we going back and forth and?
But if it does, let's say half of Auburn comes under this, staff still can't handle what's happening.
I agree.
right.
And,
But I think it's gonna be so
So-
much less.
yeah,
people
and
are
I'm not arguing that point.
Right.
I'm just saying, do we actually need the map to make this decision?
I don't.
I would agree with that. I mean, I just think that it seems pretty straightforward. The staff doesn't have the capacity to enforce it as is. So option one seems like a slam dunk from everything that I've heard tonight.
Just playing devil's advocate quickly, one of the reasons Auburn opted to have delegated review through DEP was because sometimes the review process through DEP can take 30 days or more. So I'm just curious what you just mentioned about the critical mass. How long would it be for the Maine Forestry Service to review a forestry plan once a developer submits it to you?
Well, we don't review forest management plans. We really just get those forest operation notification forms.
Okay.
And those are notifications, they don't even get approved from us.
So there's no approval process through the Forestry Service that would tie up any sort of development or anything like that?
Yep, just a notification.
Okay, then that's an
Take care of
important.
that.
Took care of that point.
Not holding anything up.
Right.
But there is one exception.
Yeah.
If someone in the industry has opted to, there's a third option here, there's two options for shade. Where is it here? They can opt to, how's this worded? So they can basically opt to submit a forestry plan that is at least protective of tree cover as option 1 or 2 here. And we only have two industries in our state that do that. Things like Irving and like Katahdin and Forest Lands,
Yeah.
the big guys up north.
And they're never gonna hit on, so.
Right. So it's very unlikely for anyone in Auburn to be doing
Do we have any other questions for our guest, who's very graciously come down here to speak with us tonight? It's a good resource, and, you know, if you have any questions, I mean, I'll certainly pass them along to Tom after this meeting, if at 3 in the morning something occurs to you. He's been very gracious about communicating and helping us through this process. So if no one else has any more questions, our next steps are to individually, as a group, determine how we want to proceed and make that recommendation to City Council.
That was my next question. Okay, thank you.
Just as a heads up for everyone here, just as a related and unrelated topic, there's 2 items regarding the Ag Resource Protection Zone. One is that there is now a draft for the Agriculture Committee that we are being asked, both the Conservation Commission and the Planning Board is being asked to review and make recommendations on. But hopefully at our next meeting or as soon as can be put on our agendas. The next item is that the mayor has a workshop scheduled for Monday regarding the Ag Resource Protection Zone in terms of the revised language and moving those concepts forward to City Council. So those 2 items are going to be popping up. I believe Jordan and Evan were both asked to speak at those workshops and present the position of the respective bodies at that So if you don't have a specific letter, you might want to establish your.
Well, since it was brought up, the mayor specifically asked for us to review the recommendations that we made and any pertinent statistics or information that we used to make that. So for instance, for the planning board, we received quite a comprehensive review of sort of main standards from some reps from the Department of Forestry and Agriculture. So for instance, that would be part of the presentation made from the planning board perspective, that this is the information, this is some of the information that we used, what our process was, what the specific recommendations were. We've been asked to really keep it, I got the impression, keep it at, this is what we came up with and this is why, and to really sort of not interject anything beyond that.
Yes, and the Conservation Commission, a couple months ago, June or July, submitted an official letter to City Council, the mayor, and the city manager about our official opinion, and it hasn't changed since. And we've similarly spoken to different state officials. We've done independent review. We had group discussion. So, it won't change from what we provided them in a letter, but I can try and dig into that to present.
Just so everyone knows, what we've been asked to present is basically to in person
to appear.
Present what has already been presented to them in writing. So.
Yes.
Yeah.
If I recall correctly, in the planning board submission to the council, you mentioned that you referenced the fact that you didn't have any background in wildlife habitat or that sort of thing, and so you were sort of accepting that. I just wanted to mention that our chair happens to be well versed in that. In case you'd like her as a reference, I'm sure she'd be happy to contribute.
Yeah, I think specifically we chose to move ahead without legal counsel. So our final recommendation sort of included a final finding that anything we say that doesn't match future or current legal counsel ought to be disregarded and go with the lawyers. So yeah.
So if you need any further material, the ag portal is still up and going. I think most of the documents have been uploaded, including the board's recommendation to the city council, and if the Conservation Commission wants to provide that to me as well, I can make sure it gets on the portal.
Sure, thank you.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question? Is that commentary for the workshop going to include commentary on the structure of the commission, or just on the ordinance?
I don't think it's going to be, I don't think they're going to include that. It's a 45-minute presentation and some
okay, thank
talking.
Yeah, we were specifically asked to focus on just the recommendation.
Okay, I was a little confused because you mentioned both issues, so
I haven't heard yet about.
Yeah, there's two things going on.
Agricultural
Okay, yeah.
Commission, so I'll have to touch base because I hadn't heard about us being provided for input on that structure yet, but I will check in.
And I can make that language on the committee if you don't have it available. I don't know if you have
Yes,
that.
please, that would be great. Yeah, we
Okay.
haven't gotten any language for that yet.
Audrey, is it 5 or 6?
What?
The workshops.
Oh, yeah, they start at 5?
5:30.
5:30? Yeah, so I'm sure it's probably the first item up. So thank you all for participating in this joint workshop. Hopefully it will be the first of others to come. I know we will be talking about other items that are of joint interest, and hopefully it can be more efficient if we do this together, as opposed to, at least the information gathering stage and, trying to do any of these deliberations in which we've got a hefty meat to cover. Might be more efficient for everybody. Thank you for making the adjustment to your schedule.
Thank you.
thank you.
All right, thank you very much for meeting. We appreciate it.
You guys,